The yacht's polished surface gleamed under the fading sunset, casting long shadows across the deck as the sound of laughter echoed in the air. On board, the guests were busy with their conversations, their eyes occasionally drifting toward the man standing quietly at the edge of the boat. The man, a black CEO in his early 40s, was dressed impeccably in a black suit, his presence commanding yet somehow distant. Nearby, his girlfriend, a stunning woman of European descent, stood with a group of friends, her laughter ringing through the air. She was beautiful, confident, and to many, the epitome of elegance. Yet, there was a coldness to her gaze when it flickered towards him. The tension was palpable. He had been standing there, alone, quietly observing the ocean, when she turned to him with a playful smirk, her voice cutting through the calm evening breeze. "You can't seriously think you can impress anyone with that," she scoffed, nodding toward the grand piano position near the far side of the yacht. "What are you going to do? Play a song? Stick to what you know." The word stung, though the CEO's face remained unreadable. He said nothing at first, the laughter around him continuing unabated. But then, with deliberate calm, he walked to the piano. The keys, polished and grand, seemed to challenge him. He sat down, his fingers hovering over the ivories for a moment before he began to play. What followed was a wave of haunting, melodic perfection, an intricate blend of classical composition that sent a shiver through the crowd. The woman's smirk faltered, her eyes widening in disbelief as the music grew richer, more commanding. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, and even the most critical of the guests were taken aback. The sound of the piano filled the air like a force of nature, and suddenly, the atmosphere on the yacht shifted. The laughter that once filled the air turned to silence, and all eyes were on him. But she was speechless, her mouth agape as the notes swirled around her, her earlier mockery now a distant echo. No one saw it coming. The rich, elegant woman who had casually dismissed him now found herself at a loss for words, standing before a man who had not only shattered the expectations of everyone around him but had also claimed his place in this world. Not just with wealth but with an undeniable presence and skill. Was this the man she thought she knew? Was this the man she had belittled for so long? As the final notes lingered in the air, a strange silence fell over the deck. No one dared speak, their minds racing to comprehend what had just unfolded. But the CEO simply stood up, nodded once, and walked away, his heart heavier with the weight of his own history. The woman's jaw dropped, the reality of the situation sinking in slowly. He was more than just a successful businessman, he was a force to be reckoned with. The crowd had underestimated him, and now they could no longer deny the depth of his complexity. But the question remained, could she? Could anyone? As he disappeared into the ship's interior, leaving behind a stunned silence, a thought lingered in the air, unanswered. Just how much had they misunderstood him? Stay tuned. The answers are only just beginning to unfold. The yacht gleamed under the setting sun, its polished surface reflecting the soft glow of the fading day. Laughter echoed from the deck, but amidst the sea of guests, one man stood apart. The black CEO, in his early 40s, dressed in a tailored black suit, looked out over the water, his expression calm, almost distant. His girlfriend, a beautiful woman of European descent, was surrounded by a group of friends. Her laugh was infectious, but when her eyes landed on him, there was a flicker of something less kind. "You're really going to play that piano?" she asked with a smirk, her voice cutting through the evening air. "What do you think this is? Some kind of talent show? Stick to what you're good at." Her words, spoken with playful condescension, were meant to sting. But he said nothing, his eyes focused on the horizon, seemingly unaffected by the barbs. She laughed again, oblivious to the tension she was creating. The laughter around her continued, but the CEO remained silent, deep in thought. Then, without a word, he walked toward the grand piano that sat by the deck, its gleaming white keys waiting. The guest's chatter died down as he sat, his fingers brushing the keys before he began to play. The music flowed out in a stunning, classical composition, every note deliberate, every chord resonating with skill and passion. The woman's smirk faltered. Immediately. Her eyes widened in disbelief, her words suddenly lost. The music filled the air, its complexity and beauty undeniable. It was clear now that he wasn't just another rich businessman, he was an artist. The crowd, which had once viewed him with mild indifference, was now enraptured by his performance. The woman stood frozen, her jaw slowly dropping as the music swirled around her, stripping away the walls of arrogance and prejudice she had built around him. No one saw it coming. The very man they had all underestimated was playing a song that defied their expectations, effortlessly transforming the atmosphere of the yacht. The CEO finished the final notes, leaving the air heavy with their resonance. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. He stood, his movements smooth and deliberate, and with a small nod, he walked away. The woman remained where she stood, the realization slowly dawning on her. She had dismissed him as nothing more than a lucky man who had made his fortune. But now, the truth was undeniable, he was more than that, he was a man of substance, a man with depth. The guests remained silent, their minds racing to catch up with what had just happened. The CEO disappeared below deck, leaving a stunned silence behind him. The woman stood motionless, unable to form words. She had thought she knew him. But in that moment, everything she had believed about him shattered. Could she ever look at him the same way again? And the real question, could anyone? As the yacht sailed into the night, one thought lingered in the air, unanswered: how had they all gotten him so wrong? Stay tuned. The story has only just begun. The next day, as the yacht slowly made its way toward the dock, the atmosphere had shifted. What had been a festive, carefree gathering just hours ago now felt like a tense silence. The guests had returned to their lives, but the energy of the night lingered in the air, heavy and uncertain. In the grand dining room, the black CEO sat alone, staring out of the large windows that overlooked the vast, endless ocean. His mind wasn't on the view, but on the events that had transpired the night before. He had seen the way his girlfriend looked at him during his piano performance. There was admiration, yes, but also something else, something he couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was surprise, or maybe even fear. Fear that he wasn't who she thought he was. He knew she was always somewhat dismissive of him, even before the yacht trip. She was beautiful, confident, and used to being admired. But with him, there was a constant undercurrent of doubt. He was a successful businessman, yes, but in her eyes, he was still just the black man who had somehow risen above his station, and that made her uncomfortable. He had heard the whispers from her friends, the subtle judgments masked behind polite smiles. It was the kind of judgment he had grown used to over the years, people who saw him as an exception rather than the rule, a success story that couldn't possibly happen without some help from luck or privilege. But the truth was, he had earned every penny, every step he had climbed. He didn't need anyone's validation, least of all hers. Still, as the days went on, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. He thought about the quiet moments they had shared earlier, her quiet mockery now replaced with an uneasy silence. She had retreated into herself, no longer making the sharp comments she usually did. Instead, she seemed distant, as if grappling with a truth she didn't want to face. It was a truth that had always been there, just below the surface, the truth that she wasn't entirely sure she could reconcile her life with someone like him. And yet, she stayed. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the apartment where they had been staying, he knew that it wouldn't be long before the reality of their relationship would come to a head. He wasn't some side character in her life, a man who existed only to fit into the role she had chosen for him. No, he was more than that. He had always been more than that. The question was, did she realize it? And even more importantly, was she ready to accept it? He didn't need her validation, but he had to know whether she was capable of seeing him for who he truly was, not just as a wealthy black man with a successful business, but as a person, with flaws, dreams, and ambitions that reached far beyond the boundaries of what anyone, especially her, had ever imagined. Later that evening, they met at the dinner table, a tension hanging thick between them. She sat down across from him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched out, thick with unspoken words. Finally, she broke the silence. "I was surprised last night," she said quietly, her voice careful, as if testing the waters. "I didn't think you could play like that." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he just looked at her, his eyes searching for any sign of honesty in her words. "You didn't think I could play?" he finally asked, his voice calm but edged with something more. "No," she admitted, looking away. But that's not the point, is it? The point is that I've never really known who you are. Her words hung in the air, more cutting than she likely intended. He could feel the weight of them, the acknowledgement of something deeper than just his musical ability. It was the truth, wasn't it? She didn't know him. Not really. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't sure she ever could. The moment passed, but the tension remained, lingering like a shadow that neither of them could escape. The next morning, the atmosphere between them was thick with unspoken tension. The words they had exchanged the night before seemed to echo in the space between them. He couldn't help but replay her confession in his mind. I've never really known who you are. Her words stung, more than he had expected. It wasn't that he was hurt by the fact that she didn't understand him, it was the realization that, perhaps, he had allowed himself to be misunderstood for too long. He had spent so many years building this empire, climbing the corporate ladder, proving to everyone that he belonged in the world of wealth and power, but somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of who he truly was. Or maybe he had hidden that part of himself, afraid that others wouldn't accept him if they saw it. He had built this persona, the black CEO who defied all odds, and in doing so, he had kept his true self locked away. But now, with her words hanging in the air, he could no longer ignore the fact that his carefully constructed image might not be enough to hold their relationship together. As the morning wore on, he found himself lost in thought, sitting by the large windows overlooking the city. He didn't want to let the conversation from the night before fester, but it seemed impossible to push it aside. The silence between them was deafening. He hadn't heard from her all morning. She had been quiet, withdrawn, a stark contrast to the confident woman he had first met. The once carefree and flirtatious nature she had exuded now felt distant, as if the weight of the truth had settled between them, and neither of them knew how to handle it. Later that afternoon, he decided to take matters into his own hands. He couldn't wait for her to approach him, not anymore. He was tired of dancing around the issue, pretending that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. It was time to have a real conversation, one that would either make or break their relationship. He found her in the living room, sitting on the couch, staring blankly at her phone. Her eyes met his as he entered the room, but there was no warmth there, no spark of the playful energy that had once drawn him to her. "We need to talk," he said, his voice firm but calm. She didn't argue, she simply nodded, setting her phone aside. The air between them was thick with expectation, each of them knowing that this conversation could change everything. He sat down across from her, his gaze steady. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," he began, his voice low. "You said you've never really known who I am, and I get that. I've been hiding parts of myself for so long, maybe even from you, but that stops now." She looked at him, a flicker of something in her eyes, surprise, maybe, or uncertainty. "I'm not just the CEO. I'm not just the man with the fancy suit and the big paycheck. I'm a person, with all the flaws, all the dreams, and all the history that comes with it. And if you can't accept that, then maybe we shouldn't be doing this anymore." His words were blunt, but they were the truth. He wasn't going to pretend anymore, not for her or anyone. There was a long pause, the weight of his words hanging in the air. She opened her mouth to say something, but hesitated, her words caught in her throat. For a moment, it felt as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for her response. When she finally spoke, her voice was small, almost reluctant. "I don't know if I can," she admitted, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I don't know if I can accept all of you, your past, your struggles, everything. It's just so different from what I'm used to." The admission stung, but he knew it was coming. It wasn't that he didn't expect her to have doubts, but hearing them out loud made it all the more real. He stood up, pacing the room for a moment as he processed her words. He couldn't deny that the path ahead was uncertain, but he was done hiding who he was. He had fought too hard for his place in the world, and he wouldn't apologize for it. "Then maybe we need to figure out if we can move forward with this," he said, his tone resolute. "But I won't change for you, and I won't change for anyone. If you're not ready to accept me for who I am, then we might be better off going our separate ways." She sat there in silence, her eyes cast downward, clearly conflicted. He had laid everything on the table, his heart exposed, and now the ball was in her court. It was up to her to decide if she was willing to face the truth and accept him for who he truly was, or if she would walk away, unable to embrace the man behind the title. The days following their conversation felt like a slow unraveling of everything they had once believed about each other. The tension in the air was palpable, thickening every time they were in the same room. The black CEO could feel it, could feel the distance that had crept in between them, unspoken and yet undeniable. He had laid everything out for her, shown her the truth about who he was, and now it seemed like the gap was growing wider instead of closer. She was distant, quieter than usual, and he couldn't help but wonder if he had pushed too hard, too fast. Was this the breaking point he had feared? Or was this just another hurdle, another challenge to overcome in the complex web of their relationship? It was clear she was still processing what he had said, still wrestling with the idea of who he really was, and whether she could ever truly accept it. He had expected that much. He knew that the world she had come from, the world of privilege and comfort, wasn't one that would easily bend to his reality. She had been raised in a world where success was measured by connections, by wealth, by status. And he had earned everything. He had fought tooth and nail for every inch of ground he stood on. His past was filled with struggles, obstacles that no one in her circle could even begin to understand. But that didn't matter now. What mattered was whether she could look past the labels and the titles, whether she could accept him for who he was beyond the business suit, the wealth, and the high-profile name. That night, they had another dinner together, though it was far from the easy, comfortable meals they used to share. The silence at the table was heavy, punctuated only by the occasional clinking of silverware against porcelain. He watched her carefully, trying to read her expression, but it was like looking at a stranger. She had put on her mask again, the one she wore when she wasn't sure what to say, when she didn't want to show vulnerability. He didn't know how much longer he could stand it. The woman he had once known was slipping further away with each passing day, and no amount of wealth or status could fix that. "You've been quiet," he said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched on for too long. She looked up from her plate, her eyes tired, worn. "I've been thinking," she said softly. "About what you said. About everything." He didn't know how to respond, didn't know if he even wanted to hear what she had to say. Part of him already feared the worst, that she would tell him it was too much, that she couldn't handle the weight of his truth. But he had to hear it. He had to know. "What have you decided?" he asked, his voice steady but low, betraying none of the turmoil he felt inside. She hesitated, clearly struggling to find the right words. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted. "I don't know if I can accept everything that comes with being with you. Your past, your struggles, they're just so different from anything I've ever known." Her words felt like a punch to the gut, but he didn't flinch. He had known deep down that this was a possibility. He had known that no matter how much he had given her, no matter how much he had hoped for her understanding, it might never be enough. But hearing her say it, was something he hadn't been prepared for. He stood up from the table, walking away to give them both some space. He needed to think, to process the weight of her words. He had fought so hard to get to where he was, to prove that he deserved a place at the table, to show that someone like him could belong. But the reality was setting in. Maybe he had been fooling himself all along, thinking that anyone, especially her, could accept him as he was. When he returned to the table, he was more composed, but the cracks were beginning to show. "I can't change for you," he said quietly, his voice heavy with the truth. "I can't pretend to be someone I'm not. And if that's something you can't handle, then maybe this is where we end." She looked at him then, her eyes full of a mix of sadness and regret. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice breaking. And that was the hardest part, seeing the woman he thought he knew, the woman he had tried so hard to understand, reduced to nothing more than confusion and fear. In that moment, he realized that this wasn't just a battle of wills. This was about something deeper, something more profound. Could she accept the man he had become, or would she forever be trapped in a world that couldn't see past the surface? Only time would tell. The days that followed felt like a slow-moving storm, each moment more charged with tension than the last. The black CEO couldn't escape the weight of their last conversation. It clung to him like a second skin, reminding him of the fragile state of their relationship. Despite everything, he refused to let it show. He focused on his work, burying himself in meetings and projects, trying to keep the world at bay. But at night, in the silence of his apartment, the thoughts came rushing back of her words, her doubts, and the growing realization that he might have asked for too much, too soon. She had said she didn't know if she could accept everything about him, the past, the struggles, the man beneath the suit and the success. And he had known, deep down, that it wasn't just about the money, or the title, or the image he had worked so hard to build. It was about something deeper, something more ingrained in their very differences. He wasn't sure if she could ever understand his world, a world shaped by hardship, by fighting for a place where he could finally breathe freely. It wasn't a world where she had ever been. As the weekend approached, the silence between them became unbearable. He saw less and less of her. She spent her days in her room, retreating into her thoughts, and he was left to wonder whether this was the end or just the beginning of something more complicated. Then, one evening, she came to him. Her eyes were red, as if she had been crying, and she looked at him as though she was seeing him for the first time. "We need to talk," she said quietly, her voice hoarse. He nodded, his heart pounding in his chest, knowing that this could be the moment everything changed. They sat down on the couch together, the space between them still feeling too wide. She was hesitant, her hands fidgeting in her lap, as if searching for the right words to say. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her voice shaky. "I've been thinking about everything, about us." He stayed silent, waiting for her to continue. "And I realized that I've been wrong," she said finally, her gaze meeting his. "I've been looking at this all wrong. I've been so focused on the idea of who I thought you were, that I never bothered to see the man in front of me. The real you." His chest tightened as he listened. He hadn't expected this. She was admitting, for the first time, that she had been blind to the complexity of who he truly was. "I was scared," she continued, her voice breaking. "I was scared that you would be too much for me, that the life you've lived, everything you've gone through, would be something I couldn't handle. But that's not true, is it? That's just my fear talking." He looked at her, unsure whether to believe what she was saying. He had heard the doubt in her voice before, and it was hard to forget. But there was something different now, a shift in her expression, a softness in her tone that hadn't been there before. "I don't want to lose you," she said quietly. "I don't want to walk away from this, from you." His heart softened at her words, but he still wasn't sure if this was the change he had been hoping for or if it was just another moment of confusion. He had fought so hard to build himself up, to get to this point, and now she was telling him that she could see him, really see him. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low, as if testing the waters. "Because I need to know that you understand what this means. That you're not just seeing the version of me that you think I should be." She nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm sure," she said, her voice steady now. "I want to understand. I want to try. I know it won't be easy, but I want to give us a chance." There was a long pause, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the air between them felt lighter, less charged. He reached out, taking her hand in his, the weight of her words settling into him like a slow, steady promise. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be more hurdles, more moments of doubt and fear. But in that moment, he realized that they were both willing to try to fight for something real, something beyond the labels, the expectations, and the fears that had held them back. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. And for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that it could be enough. The days that followed were a delicate balancing act, both of them carefully testing the waters of a new understanding. The Black CEO could feel a shift, a subtle yet powerful change between them, but he knew better than to rush it. It wasn't going to be easy, not after all the walls they had built, but he could sense that she was trying, and that was enough for now. She was no longer distant, instead, she was opening up, though not entirely. Every conversation felt like a small victory, a step forward in a journey they had both been hesitant to take. The CEO found himself looking at her with new eyes, seeing the vulnerability that had been hidden beneath her confident exterior. She had always been a woman who exuded power, control, and elegance, but now, he saw the cracks in that facade. She was scared of what they could become, of the life she had built being turned upside down by the reality of who he was, by the complexities of his past and present. She was learning to see him, truly see him, for the first time, and it was a process that both scared and excited her. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony of their apartment, the city lights twinkling below them like a million tiny stars, she turned to him, her voice tentative but steady. "I've been thinking," she began, her eyes searching his. "About everything, about how much I've underestimated you, about how much I've misunderstood your life." He looked at her, unsure of what she was going to say, but knowing that this was important. "I thought I knew you," she continued, her voice soft. "But I was wrong. I saw the title, the wealth, the success, and I thought that was all there was to you. I didn't see the man who had to fight for everything, who had to prove himself at every turn." She paused, taking a deep breath as if gathering the courage to speak the next words. "I didn't see the parts of you that make you who you really are." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, the CEO didn't know how to respond. He had heard these kinds of admissions before, but this time it felt different. This time, she was truly acknowledging him, not as a symbol of success or as an object of admiration, but as a person, someone with depth, with history, with struggles that she hadn't fully understood until now. "I'm sorry," she said, her eyes meeting his with sincerity. "I've spent so much time being scared of you, of what it means to be with someone like you. I didn't know how to handle the truth of who you are." He reached out, his hand resting gently on hers, feeling the weight of her words settle into his chest. It wasn't forgiveness he was looking for, it was understanding, and for the first time, he felt like she was beginning to understand him. "I don't need you to be sorry," he said softly, his voice steady. "I just need you to see me, to really see me, not as the man you want me to be, but as the man I am. And that's all I've ever asked for." She nodded, her gaze never leaving his, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to believe that maybe they could make it work. Maybe they could move forward, not as two people trying to fit into each other's idea of what they should be, but as two individuals who had the courage to face the truth of who they really were. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable, it was filled with understanding, with the unspoken recognition that they were both taking steps toward something real. The journey wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to take it. For the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. They were in this together, and that meant more than anything else. "Thank you," she said after a long pause, her voice full of emotion. "For being patient with me. For showing me who you really are." He smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "We're both learning, every day," he replied. And in that moment, for the first time, he believed it. They were learning, both of them, and it was enough. The following weeks were a delicate dance between progress and setbacks, the Black CEO and his girlfriend both learning to navigate the shifting tides of their relationship. The early tension that had plagued them began to dissolve, replaced by something more tangible and understanding, a mutual respect for the complexities of each other's lives. Yet, the journey was far from simple. There were moments when the weight of his past seemed to resurface, threatening to pull them back into the discomfort they had tried so hard to move beyond. The CEO, despite his growing confidence in his relationship, found himself caught between the need to maintain his sense of self and the desire to be accepted fully, flaws and all. There were days when the old insecurities crept in, when he wondered whether he was truly worthy of the woman who had once looked at him with such doubt, but each time, he pushed those thoughts aside. The more they spent time together, the more he realized that their differences weren't barriers to overcome but bridges to cross, and he was ready to meet her halfway. On a crisp evening, with the city skyline glowing in the distance, the CEO found himself sitting with her at a small, intimate restaurant, the kind of place where they could talk without the distractions of their hectic lives. As they shared a quiet dinner, he could feel the ease between them, the comfort of being in each other's presence without the heavy tension that had once defined their interactions. It was the first time in a long while that they had felt truly connected, without the ghosts of the past clouding their conversation. "You know," she said, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said before. About who you really are, beyond the success and the title." He looked at her, surprised by the depth of her words. She had always been one to speak her mind, but tonight, her voice held a softness, an openness that he hadn't heard before. "And," he asked, his voice gentle, And I realized something, she continued, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his heart skip a beat. I've spent so much of my life thinking I knew exactly what I wanted, what I needed. I thought I had everything figured out, but then I met you, and everything I thought I knew about myself, about love, about life, just changed. I never imagined that someone like you could be so much more than what I saw on the surface. His heart swelled at her words, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. It wasn't that he had expected her to change overnight, but hearing her acknowledge the depth of who he was felt like a victory, one that had been years in the making. I've never been good at this, she admitted softly, at really seeing someone for who they are, instead of what they represent. But with you, I feel like I'm finally starting to understand what it means to truly know someone. He smiled, a mixture of relief and gratitude flooding through him. It's not always easy, he said, but it's worth it. We're worth it. She nodded, her hand reaching across the table to take his. I want to keep learning, keep growing, she said, her voice steady. I know we have a long way to go, but I'm ready. I'm ready to see you really see you. And not just the CEO, not just the man who built this empire. I want to know the man behind all of it. The man I'm falling in love with. Her words, simple yet profound, wrapped around his heart, filling the space between them with warmth. He squeezed her hand gently, grateful beyond measure for the honesty that had finally bridged the gap between them. It wasn't just about their differences anymore, it was about the willingness to understand, to embrace, to move forward together. As they finished their dinner, the CEO felt a quiet sense of peace settle within him. This was just the beginning, but for the first time in a long time, he truly believed that they could make it together. Weeks passed, and the relationship between the black CEO and his girlfriend began to evolve into something deeper, something real. The rawness of their past conversations, the uncomfortable truths they had faced, now felt like the foundation upon which they were building something stronger. Each day, they found new ways to connect, to understand each other in ways they had never thought possible. The CEO felt a sense of peace he had not known in years. There were no more walls between them, no more doubts about who they were, just the truth, the unfiltered reality of their emotions, and the shared desire to move forward together. He noticed the small changes in her, the way she now saw him with a different kind of appreciation, a deeper respect. She had come to understand that his success was not just a result of luck, but of hard work, sacrifice, and a relentless pursuit of his dreams. And in turn, he had come to see her not just as the woman he had once admired from afar, but as someone who was beginning to see him as a whole person, someone who was ready to accept his flaws as well as his strengths. Their bond was no longer defined by their differences but by their shared willingness to grow, to learn, and to love. One evening, after a long day filled with meetings and business calls, the CEO returned to their apartment, tired, but content. The city was quiet, the soft hum of traffic outside the windows, and the glow of the streetlights casting a warm, golden hue across the room. She was already there, sitting by the window with a cup of tea in her hands, her gaze lost in the view. He walked over, his footsteps quiet, and without saying a word, he sat down beside her. For a moment, they simply sat in silence, the comfortable kind of silence that only comes when two people truly understand each other. She turned to him, a smile on her lips, her eyes sparkling with a softness he hadn't seen before. I've been thinking, she said, her voice gentle but serious, about how far we've come. He looked at her, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. Yeah, he asked, his voice low, curious. Yeah, she replied, taking a small sip of her tea. I think about everything we've been through, how much we've had to confront, and how we've made it through. And I know we're not perfect, but I think we're better together. Her words were simple, but they meant more to him than she could ever understand. In that moment, he realized just how much they had both changed, how much they had both grown. They had fought their way through the complexities of their relationship, and in doing so, they had created something stronger than either of them had expected. He reached out, taking her hand in his, the warmth of her skin grounding him, reminding him of the path they had chosen. I agree, he said softly, his voice steady. We've come a long way, but I think we're just getting started. She smiled, squeezing his hand gently. I think so too. The rest of the evening passed quietly, the weight of their unspoken understanding filling the room. There were no more fears of what the future might hold, no more doubts about their ability to face whatever challenges lay ahead. They had proven to themselves, and to each other, that they were strong enough to navigate the complexities of their lives, their differences, and their dreams. As the night deepened, the CEO allowed himself to relax fully, to let go of the tension he had carried for so long. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly at peace, not because everything was perfect, but because they were learning to accept each other, to love each other, in the raw, imperfect way that real relationships require. And for the first time in a long time, he believed that they could make it, whatever the future held. As the weeks continued to unfold, the relationship between the Black CEO and his girlfriend deepened into something that felt more grounded, more real. They had faced the hurdles, the awkward conversations, the fears, and the insecurities, but now they were beginning to see each other for who they truly were, without the barriers of judgment and misconception that had once clouded their vision. The challenges were far from over, but they were no longer fighting against each other, they were fighting alongside each other, learning to navigate the complexities of their shared lives. For the first time, the CEO felt like he was not only accepted but embraced, not for the man who wore a suit and carried a title, but for the man who had lived through struggles, overcome obstacles, and risen to where he was despite all odds. His girlfriend had started to understand that, and he could see it in her eyes, in the way she now approached him with a quiet respect. She had started to see him as a person, not just as a black man with money or a high-ranking CEO, but as someone who had earned his place in the world with resilience and heart. They had moved past the point where they saw their differences as insurmountable. Now, those differences were simply parts of the whole that made them who they were. The CEO had always believed that true connection came from honesty, from sharing the raw truths that often go unspoken. He had told her about his past, about the obstacles he had faced growing up, about the pain of being doubted simply because of the color of his skin, about the nights he spent questioning whether he would ever truly belong. It had been hard, harder than he had expected, but it had been necessary. He needed her to understand the depth of his experience, the weight of what he carried with him every day. And she had listened. She hadn't just heard his words, she had listened, truly listened, and it had made all the difference. Now, they were sitting together one evening, a rare moment of calm amidst their busy lives. The city lights twinkled outside their window, the soft hum of the streetlights filtering in through the glass. It was late, but they were both awake, as if the quiet of the night had given them the space to talk about the things they had been holding back. "I was thinking," she began, her voice soft but clear, "about how far we've come. About everything we've been through and how much we've learned about each other." He nodded, listening closely. "I know we've had our moments," she continued, her gaze steady, "but I've never felt more certain about us. About you." The CEO felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. It was the kind of certainty he had never known before, the kind of confidence that came not from external success but from the knowledge that they were in this together. "I'm glad," he said simply, his voice steady. "Because I feel the same way." She smiled at him, a genuine, soft smile that spoke volumes more than words could ever say. "I know we've had our doubts," she said, "but I think we've come to a place where we're not just trying to make this work, we're actually building something real, something that's ours." The CEO squeezed her hand, his heart full. "Yeah," he agreed. "Something real." They sat in silence for a moment, both of them contemplating the road ahead. There would be obstacles, no doubt, things they would have to face that they hadn't yet considered, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what was to come. Together, they had the strength to overcome anything. And that, more than anything else, was what he had been searching for all along, someone who truly saw him, who accepted him not just for what he had accomplished, but for who he was. As they sat there, the weight of the world outside seemed to fade, and all that was left was the quiet certainty that they were on the same path, moving forward together, hand in hand, ready for whatever the future held. As the weeks turned into months, the CEO and his girlfriend found themselves in a rhythm, a delicate but undeniable bond forming between them. They had both come so far, and yet the journey ahead still loomed before them, full of unknowns. There were moments when old fears resurfaced, when the weight of their past seemed to press heavily on their shoulders, but they had learned to face these moments together, each time growing stronger. The CEO had learned not to hide behind his success, not to bury the pain of his past beneath the polished surface of his achievements. And in turn, his girlfriend had learned to look past the surface, past the wealth, past the title, and see him for who he truly was, a man who had fought for everything he had, a man who was more than just a symbol of success, but a person with a story, with struggles, with depth. She had stopped fearing the weight of his past, stopped fearing the complexity of his identity. And as they moved forward, their relationship became something neither of them had ever expected, something real, something that could weather any storm. One evening, after a particularly long day, they found themselves sitting on the balcony of their apartment, the city sprawling below them in a sea of lights. The air was cool, and the night felt peaceful, almost surreal. For the first time in a while, they had no distractions, no external pressures. It was just the two of them, sharing the quiet of the night. She turned to him, her expression thoughtful, and for a moment, he wondered where her mind was. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice soft, "about how much we've been through, about how much we've changed." He looked at her, his heart skipping a beat, unsure of what she was going to say. He had learned to trust her words, but the vulnerability in her voice still caught him off guard. "And," he asked, his voice gentle. "I think we've both grown," she continued, her eyes meeting his. "Not just in terms of our relationship, but in who we are as people. I see things differently now, things I never thought I would be able to see." The CEO felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't realized just how much her words would mean to him. To hear her acknowledge the journey they had been on, to hear her admit that she had changed as a result of it, was more than he could have ever expected. He reached out and took her hand in his, the simple gesture speaking volumes more than words ever could. "You've changed too," he said softly, his voice steady. "And I think we're both better for it." She smiled, squeezing his hand in return. "I never thought I would get to this place, not after everything we've been through. I thought it would be impossible to understand you fully, to accept all that you've been through. But now I know that I can, and that makes all the difference." The CEO smiled back at her, a mixture of relief and contentment flooding through him. It wasn't that their relationship was perfect, but it was real. And that was more than enough. "We've come a long way," he said, "but we're just getting started." The words felt like a promise, a vow that no matter what came next, they would face it together. They had learned to love each other not despite their differences, but because of them. The complexities of their lives, the struggles they had faced individually, had only made their bond stronger. They had built something solid, something that couldn't easily be broken, and in that moment, he realized just how much he had needed her to see him for who he truly was. Not just the CEO, not just the man with the wealth, but the person who had fought every day to make something of himself. And now, she had truly seen him. Together, they had built a foundation, one that would support them as they faced whatever challenges lay ahead. And for the first time in a long time, he felt certain that they could overcome anything as long as they were together. As the months continued to pass, the black CEO and his girlfriend settled into a rhythm that felt natural, grounded in the understanding they had worked so hard to build. The tension that had once existed between them was gone, replaced by a quiet but firm connection that had weathered the storms of their past misunderstandings and fears. The CEO had come to realize that true success wasn't just about building an empire, but about the relationships you cultivated along the way. He had spent so much of his life focused on climbing the corporate ladder, fighting for recognition in a world that often overlooked him simply because of the color of his skin, but now, sitting beside the woman who had once doubted him, he understood that the real victory lay in being seen for who he truly was. She had learned to appreciate the man behind the title, to see him not just as the successful entrepreneur, but as the person who had lived through hardship and triumph alike, a person who had never allowed his past to define him but had instead used it to propel himself forward. And as they grew together, he saw her not just as the woman he had admired from afar, but as someone who had overcome her own fears, someone who had faced the uncomfortable truths about herself and her own prejudices and had come out stronger for it. They were no longer two people trying to force themselves into each other's expectations, they were two individuals who had chosen to build something real, something lasting, based on mutual respect and understanding. Their relationship was still a work in progress, but it felt like a steady, unwavering foundation upon which they could build their future. One evening, as they sat together in the quiet of their home, the CEO found himself reflecting on just how far they had come. He looked over at her, her face illuminated by the soft light of the lamp, and realized that, despite everything they had been through, he had never been more certain of anything in his life. She had become his equal, his partner in every sense of the word. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "I never thought we would get to this point, not after everything." She looked at him, a small smile playing on her lips. "Neither did I," she admitted, her voice warm. "But here we are." "Here we are," he echoed, the weight of her words settling into him. There was a time when he had been afraid that their differences would tear them apart, that the barriers between them would be too high to overcome. But now, he realized that those very differences had only strengthened their bond. They had both worked to understand each other, to see each other for who they truly were, and that had made all the difference. "I used to think I had to have everything figured out," she continued, "but now, I know that it's okay not to have all the answers. What matters is that we're here together, learning and growing together." The CEO smiled at her, his heart full of gratitude. He had spent so many years searching for a sense of belonging, but now, for the first time, he felt truly at home, not in his wealth, not in his business, but in the life they were building together. "I couldn't agree more," he said softly, his voice steady. "We're stronger together than we could ever be apart." And as they sat there, the world outside seeming so far away, he realized that their journey was just beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, no doubt, but he knew that with her by his side, they could face anything. Together, they had built something real, something that would endure, and that was worth more than anything he had ever accomplished on his own. The days that followed seemed to stretch out before them, full of promise and possibility. The black CEO and his girlfriend had reached a place in their relationship where the future no longer seemed daunting. They had weathered the storms, faced the difficult conversations, and learned to accept each other for who they truly were, not for the roles they played or the expectations placed upon them. The CEO, once consumed by the need to prove himself in the world of business, now found a deeper sense of fulfillment in the quiet moments shared with the woman who had come to understand him in ways he had never imagined. He no longer felt the weight of being an outsider in his own success. She had shown him that love, understanding, and acceptance could be more valuable than anything money or status could bring. They had found a new rhythm in their lives together, a balance between their individual aspirations and their shared goals. The challenges they had faced, the doubts they had both harbored, had been stepping stones that led them to this point. And now, as they sat together one evening, watching the sun set over the horizon, the CEO could not help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. His journey had never been easy, but it had led him here, to a place where he could finally be himself, without fear, without the need to impress or conform. He looked over at her, and for a moment, everything else faded away. She was more than just his partner now, she was his equal, his support, his reflection. Together, they had built something lasting, something that could withstand the pressures of the world around them. "You know," he said, his voice quiet but filled with conviction, "I used to think that success was all about the destination, that it was about getting to the top and staying there. But now, I realize that the real success is in the journey. It's in the people we meet along the way, the relationships we build, and the way we evolve together." She smiled at him, her eyes soft with understanding. "I feel the same way," she replied, her voice steady. "We've come so far, not just as individuals but as a couple. And the best part is, we're still learning, still growing. I think the journey is the best part too." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared experiences settling over them. The world around them seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the two of them, content in each other's company, ready for whatever the future held. The CEO had spent so much of his life focused on proving himself, on making his mark on the world. But now, he realized that his true legacy wasn't in the empire he had built, it was in the love and respect he had found with the woman sitting beside him, in the partnership they had forged together. He no longer had to fight to be seen. She saw him, truly saw him, and that was more than enough. "I'm grateful for you," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "For everything you've taught me, for the way you've loved me. I never thought I could find someone who truly understood me, but here you are." She reached over and took his hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "And I'm grateful for you," she said softly. "For showing me that love doesn't have to fit into a box, that it can be messy, complicated, but still beautiful. For showing me who you really are." The CEO smiled, his heart full, knowing that their story was far from over. It was just beginning. And for the first time in a long time, he believed that they could face whatever challenges came their way, together.